Volodymyr Andreshuk, track and field, 22 years old, died fighting at Bakhmut. Karina Bakur, kickboxer, 19 years old, killed by a bomb in Kharkiv. Irina Dyachenko, rhythmic gymnast, 11 years old, killed by the Russians in Mariupol. Maxim Helenchenko, boxer, 22 years old, died fighting in Luhansk. Pavlo Ishenko, powerlifter, 33 years old, killed on the front. Victoria Ivashko, judo, 9 years old, died in an airstrike on her home in Kiev region. Alexei Kabarov, shooter, 31 years old, died fighting in Donetsk region. Ivan Kononenko, weightlifter, 42 years old, died in combat. Mikita Kuzebenko, diver, 31 years old, died in combat. Darya Kurtl, dancer, 20 years old, killed while at a training ground in Kryvyi Rih. Andrei Kutsenko, cyclist, 32 years old, killed in combat. Maria Lebid, dancer, 15 years old, died in a missile strike on Dnipro. Alexei Lohinov, ice hockey player, 23 years old, died in Luhansk region. Yevhen Mileshev, biathlete, 19 years old, died fighting near Kharkiv. Alina Perhidova, weightlifter, 14 years old, died in Mariupol. Roman Polishchuk, high jumper, 25 years old, killed in combat. Dmitro Sapar, figure skater, 25 years old, died fighting at Bakhmut. Taras Shpuk, endurance athlete and coach for the Invictus Games, died in combat. Katerina Troyan, track and field, 32 years old, died fighting near Pokrovsk. Andrei Yeremenko, wrestler, died in combat. Fedir Yepifanov, fencer, 18 years old, died in combat. Nazar Zui, boxer and footballer, 13 years old, killed by the Russians in Mariupol. These were the names and faces of Ukrainian athletes who were killed by the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine, as displayed on the helmet of Ukrainian skeleton sledder Vladislav Hershkevich. Winter Olympic athletes are often allowed to decorate their helmets with something meaningful to them. Vladislav chose to honor his country's dead, his colleagues in sport whose lives were taken from them by the Russians. However, the International Olympic Committee considered this to be a political statement and barred him from wearing it. When he insisted that he would wear this helmet, he was barred from competing, removed from the Olympics because of this political statement that it was bad that people died. Other Olympians on Team Ukraine were also barred from showing these displays, but with pretty innocuous statements such as, "Be brave like Ukrainians," some poetry, some simple displays of Ukrainian culture and pride in being Ukrainian, all barred for being political. The other Olympians followed through on these demands from the International Olympic Committee and did not wear their helmets and were able to compete because of it. Vladislav was the only one dropped out entirely. It was a controversial Olympics, to say the least, for Ukrainians. But then, for reasons which I wasn't able to fully imbibe, the Paralympics were so much worse. The Paralympics are like the Olympics, but for people with some kind of physical disability. And this time around, the Paralympic Committee, a separate organization from the Olympics, but tied together time-wise, decided that this year, Russia would be invited back to compete under their own flag. Prior to this, Russians were able to compete, but had to do so under a neutral flag, for reasons I'll get into a bit later. But this time, they were fully allowed to just compete as Russians under Russian flag. And the thing with the Paralympics and the fact that it is by people with physical disabilities is that some of these physical disabilities come from war. And 5 members of the Russian team, again allowed to compete under their own flag and their own country's auspices, received their injuries while invading Ukraine. And these are the people that Ukrainians were expected to compete next to. And for that reason, the Ukrainians backed out of taking part in the opening ceremony, the opening flag march that everyone is familiar with. But to add even more insult to this, the organizers of the Paralympics had somebody else carry the Ukrainian flag for the missing team. Ukraine's decision was not respected as the Paralympics tried to sidestep the insulting and disgusting decision that it made just to pretend like everyone was fine with it. they were not fine. And from there, the family of an athlete in the Ukrainian team was barred from bringing a Ukrainian flag to the competition, saying that Ukrainian, along with Russian and Belarusian flags, were banned for being political. It keeps coming up, and believe me, this will be a motif of this episode. Hello and welcome to the March 31st edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. On this episode of Ukraine Without Hype, we'll be talking about the influence of Russia on the world of sport. This will include a brief overview of the history of Russia and before that the Soviet Union in world sporting bodies. It's very tumultuous recent history leading up to the full-scale invasion of 2022, and then wrapping up with some specific examples of how different international sporting organizations and sport in general has been corrupted by Russian influence and how. If you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, please go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our Discord, ask us questions, and contribute to episodes such as these. Politics and sport. These two go together completely. The original Olympic Games, held in Greece, were a religious festival. They're not simply competition. They're an expression of, as you might call it, faith, of sacrifice, and the formation of Greek identity, such as it was. And when the Olympic movement was formed, it was, of course, just as political as anything else. Now, my own sporting background, I did a little bit in high school, but I really got involved in the history of judo as it pertains to the world sporting movement. Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, was very much involved in the Olympic movement, and he saw sport as a form of education. He was an anti-militarist, and at a time where being an anti-militarist was not welcome in Imperial Japan, and he was probably assassinated. But it was all tied together in this broader idea of using sport to reinvigorate a people throughout the world who had, this is a very large topic, so it's hard to really find a good place to talk about it, but there was a feeling at the end of the 19th century that people's moral character was degraded by the Industrial Revolution. People had begun to be more urban. They were working in factories as opposed to the farm, standing in place one day, doing, a repetitive movement, the body just breaking down in that way, and a lot of poor health that many saw different ways to fix. This included lots of diet, big resurgence of esoteric practices. Eugenics was a very big part of reacting to this question in sport. And as I was developing, there were all these kinds of new political movements, national movements, ethnic autonomy, trade unions, political leagues that all sought to use sport to, one, increase the vitality of their membership and to show that vitality off to the outside world. The physical bodies of our members, the members of our nation, the members of our trade union, the members of whatever the case may be, are vital, and therefore we are a serious movement. There are also, of course, religious aspects to this. Muscular Christianity was a big part of this. So the act of keeping a body healthy was seen as an act of moral health, of spiritual health. But there's also a heavy class component, and that's one thing where the Olympics get kind of weird. One of many things, of course, because at this time there's beginning to be a real split between amateur sport and professional sport. And at the time, professional sport was seen as something for the lower classes, something vulgar. It's something that you had to do as a job, while amateur sport was a higher calling done by the upper classes that didn't need to be ruined by something as tawdry as money. The Olympic movement was very tied to amateur sport movement, and the ban on professional sportsmen was essentially a way to preserve the class character of the Olympics. At the time, the biggest sport was boxing, and that, for a good reason, is probably the sport where you see this influence most strongly, where there is professional boxing, where the point system itself is geared towards hoping for a knockout, while amateur sport is supposed to be more of the scientific boxing, where points matter more of how many hits you get in, because that was seen as a more upper class, more proper way to fight. And in response to the somewhat elitism of the Olympics, there were also socialist alternatives to the Olympics. The International Worker Olympiad, which interestingly enough was being held in Spain on the very dawn of the Spanish Civil War. And many of the athletes who went to Spain to compete in it stayed in Spain to fight in that Civil War. So this is the soil that modern sport grows out of. It began with politics. Now, a lot of it was also tied into working together and anti-militarism and uniting the world as one, which was a big belief that people had pre-World War I, various utopian ideas of the ways in which people can bond together that was torn apart on Flanders fields. But this is all politics. Class politics, national politics, and then add in the element that this is countries competing against each other. That will always be politics. So the idea that any of this can be detached from politics is absurd. And then follow that history a little bit more. Most of what you see now about the aesthetics of the Olympics, the torch ceremony, for example, that was added in 1936 Olympics, hosted in Berlin, the Nazi Olympics. Now, does this mean that the torch ceremony is inherently fascist? I would not say that necessarily, but it is certainly nationalist. It was formed with the idea in mind of showing off how good each of these countries are at sport and therefore how good these countries are in general. That's politics. I can think of, billions more examples of how sport is not separate from politics in the general sense. But I want to focus more on Russia and the Soviet Union, because that's ultimately what we're talking about here, the influence of Russia on sport. From very early on, the Soviet Union considered sport to be an ideological priority. Like I said just then, excellence at sport meant excellence in physical presence of the actual human body itself, which was a major fixation on early 20th century, late 19th century modernist political movements. Socialism, liberalism is where we get the Boy Scouts, fascism, everything. Everyone had something to say, and the Soviets were no exception to that. They were a way to demonstrate excellence. And so, when the Soviet Union got its sporting programs going, a lot of the associations that developed sport were attached, like everything else in the Soviet Union, to some part of the state. And even now, the teams. So, the main team in Kiev is Dynamo Kiev. Dynamo was the sports association of the KGB. CSKA was attached to the army, Lokomotiv attached to the rail workers, Arsenal, elements of the state, and in many ways, elements of the most violent parts of the state. The KGB, through Dynamo, developed a lot of the physical programs for the military. Sambo, for example. Sambo is a type of wrestling that is a martial arts nerd. I'm going to try to slow this down. But basically, there are two guys that were trying to put Sambo together. One of them was a very high-level judo player, spent a lot of time in studying under the original founders of judo in Japan. He lived in part of the Soviet Union that was adjacent to Japan, and eventually, because of that, was suspected by the KGB of being a Japanese spy and was killed. Well, the other guy was kind of a grappling nerd, collected the techniques and training practices from throughout the Soviet Union, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and tried to fuse together a grappling system out of that. And between the two streams, apparently these guys never met each other, but the two instructional lineages of these two guys were merged together as Sambo and became taught throughout the Soviet security forces. And because these sport associations were associated with the army, associated with the KGB, associated with these other things, you remember what I just said about the difference between professional sports and amateurism? That distinction did not exist in the Soviet Union. An athlete was an athlete. Whereas in America, let's face it, the highest levels of athletic achievement get shuffled off into professional sports. If you are just generally a phenomenally explosive athlete who has the ability to do anything because they're just good at everything, you're going to go to football or basketball, depending on your physical body and what you're best suited to. But you're probably not going to stick to wrestling, which doesn't really have much of a money-making future after university. You don't have any money making in university either, but you know my point. And because of this, the Soviet Union was able to devote the resources to each athlete. Some sports are obviously more prestigious than others, but there wasn't that economic decision that had to be made. An athlete was a army officer, and their military duty was doing this sport, no matter what it was. This heavy focus by the state on sport also lent itself to much more systemic approach. Again, compared to America, a lot of the smaller sports are kind of neglected because there's not the economic incentive to it. And therefore, the resources available to it are reliant on fundraising, sponsorships, can be pretty lucrative, once every 4 years when the Olympics come around. But because nobody's watching swimming or anything like that in between, it's harder to keep up. Now, if you're America is a bit of an exception to this, where there's enough money in a lot of these sports anyway, that they're able to develop a lot of very cutting edge trainings and such. But if you're a smaller country, that's harder to pull together. For the Soviet Union, because this is all 100% backed by the state, because the state saw this as a priority to promote themselves, there were a lot of developments in the field of kinesiology, training, diet, all that kind of stuff, to the point where if you're a weightlifter, for example, a lot of things are named after parts of the former Eastern Bloc, Bulgaria in particular. And the sports that I know best are grappling, so in this case, judo and wrestling. And if you look at the influence of the Soviet system on judo, it was very scientific, very much built on the assumption that you're able to take someone from a very young age and they're in the system until they retire. They're there. You own them. And so the training methodology stretches over the course of an entire wrestler's life. In America, for example, a wrestler is competing from middle school, like every week during the season. And you want them to be successful in those competitions from very early on, because the way you get noticed by universities or whatever is by being a really good high school athlete, and to be placed in a high school program, this sometimes includes being a good middle school athlete. You have to be noticed, you're competing for those spots. But this kind of leads to a very grinding system that can be suboptimal, has its trade-offs. Wrestlers are known for being incredibly tough because this system is so grueling. While in the Soviet system, instead, they focused much more on building up the athlete from an early age with things like gymnastics, coordination, that are not directly applicable to throwing them directly into competitions, but can build the foundations for a more dominant athlete who is 22 years old, 23, before they retire, before they're 30. It's a longer scale approach. In this idea of Soviet sporting methodologies, which, by the way, also included lots of steroids, doping, science, not just sports science. And all of this was very much part of the stereotypes about the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Think of the movie Rocky IV. We have Rocky Balboa, poor street tough from Philly, who's just kind of on his own because he's such a bum, eventually getting things together and competing, becoming famous, all that. But in Rocky IV, even though he's already famous at this point, he is in a barn in like the middle of the Russian tundra doing sit-ups in a barn, while Ivan Drago, who, aside within all this, in the new Creed movies, it turns out that Ivan Drago was a Ukrainian, but like a super Russophone Ukrainian. So basically, the movie set up that Ivan Drago was the kind of guy who in 2022 would have squirreled away with the Russian army. Basically, he's like a hardcore pro-Russian Ukrainian guy or whatever. And Drago had a bunch of scientists watching after him, all these sensors, and they're just injecting him with tons of roids. And this is, of course, a stereotype based on Cold War assumptions about how the world works, but it was based in reality. It wasn't from nowhere. That was how the Soviets treated sport. And then comes the high point of Soviet sport propaganda, the 1980 Olympics, which, by the way, Kiev was a co-host for. We still have Olympijski Stadium, which was a host for some of these events, and it was a huge part of Soviet culture. Now, one of the old stereotypes of Ukrainian and Russian and Belarusian, like post-Soviet gobniki, is that they wear their Adidas tracksuits, and that comes from the 1980 Olympics. The Adidas tracksuit was given away to athletes at these Olympics and therefore became a massive cultural indicator. It was something from the West, from Germany, that was now available in a certain quantity in the Soviet Union, and the people who wore it were athletes. I was talking about how important the Soviet Union treated these athletes, but these athletes were, it was good to be an athlete in the Soviet Union for many reasons. Of course, there was this cultural prestige that went with it, but also keep in mind, athletes get to travel. If you're a Soviet athlete, you're headed off to all these other countries to compete in. You were watched very heavily by the KGB. There's no escaping the eyes of the Soviet state. But a lot of the people who were actually able to escape the Soviet Union because of this were athletes. They had the easiest job of it. Another job that was similar in this response is sailor. Keep this all pinned for the post-Soviet era. The iconography of the 1980 Olympics became very famous, close to a lot of people's hearts. But the 1980 Olympics were boycotted by the United States as well as many other countries, though not Europe, by the way, because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Politics and sports again. And then the follow-up Olympics were in Los Angeles, which, by the way, are the location of the next World Cup. And the Soviet Union did a reciprocal boycott to the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. And the especially is full of these stories of the United States and Soviet Union competing together in the field of sport, because it was hard to do so directly. Certainly shot at each other at various points in time, including in the Vietnam War, but it had to not be acknowledged. The conflict of the Cold War was indirect, between proxies and in theaters that were not fully recognized as being conflict between the two. But sport is something different. It's conflict without the conflict, and carried with it all of the issues of national pride that went with it. And so with, for example, the 1981 quote, Miracle on Ice. I think a lot of you have seen the movie. One of the great sports stories of the 1980s, when in the 1980 Winter Olympics, the American team was considered very much an underdog compared to the Soviet team, partially again because of this difference between amateurism and professionalism that the Soviets were able to bypass entirely. And so when the American team won, again, after the boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics, it was huge. And again, I refer to Rocky IV, the most 80s of movies, in my opinion, which ends with Rocky beating the Soviet boxer who killed his friend, and at the end standing up and saying, if I can change, you can change, and we can all change. And he ended the Cold War via mutual love of sport. It was very much a part of the zeitgeist. Separating politics from sport, have we ever done this ever? But then comes the post-Soviet period. A lot of the things that tied the Soviet system together are now gone. A lot of the interconnectivity, a lot of the funding. Where does the money come from? In the Soviet Union, they were able to put aside a part of the state budget to support sporting programs, to support these athletes from a very early age until eventually being given a fake job as retirement. Does that still exist after the Soviet Union is gone? And for most post-Soviet republics, the answer was no. They just couldn't afford them. Russia, however, could, or at least it made the decision to. Even during the 90s, when things were going pretty bad, Russia prioritized this sporting program and continue to be fairly successful. Because here's the thing with sporting programs, they take money, and if you can't afford to support them, someone can't make it their full-time job with all the resources that it takes to reach peak athletic performance. In some sports, there's some flexibility on this. If you look at Central Asia, these were especially poor countries in the 90s. There's some bounce back now, but they were still pretty good at martial arts, judo, wrestling, and weightlifting, because there's a bit less of a monetary support needed for these and more of a cultural support for them. So to have people wrestling, you just need enough space where you don't bonk your head on something metal. That's really it. But Russia kept everything going, and being an athlete was still highly prestigious. Now remember what I said about what it meant to be an athlete in the Soviet period. You could travel. And here's what that means in the Soviet system. You can travel means you can smuggle. And so as the criminal system of the 1990s began to develop, you already had a class of people who had international connections, had international travel, who had experience in, sneaking a few pairs of jeans into the country and selling them off for a tidy profit, and who were very physically capable. Well, now you have the basis of the mafia, don't you? The boxing gyms, the wrestling mats of the Soviet era became the nucleus of organized crime in the 1990s. There are other elements of this, of course. This isn't purely a story of sport. A lot of this came down to veterans of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a bunch of people who were very well armed, had training in how to do violence, suddenly no longer having the state support for that violence and shopping their skill sets elsewhere. But now you have the regional championship middleweight boxer. One way to support yourself is to do what Rocky did, be a mob enforcer. This isn't particularly a Russian specific issue. Boxing has always been tied into organized crime, but in an era where organized crime was blossoming. There you go. And because of this prestige, as political parties are forming, having a few athletes around was seen as both a kind of a thank you, retirement program for that athlete, and also a way to support yourself. So, one of the most famous wrestlers of all time was Alexander Karelin, record of 887-2. Gold medals at the 1988 Seoul Games, 1992 Barcelona Games, 1996 Atlanta Games before being shuffled off with a silver medal at the 2000 Sydney game. Famous for the Karelin lift, where he would just pick up a dude and throw him down. Well, if you go to his later career, he was invited by Vladimir Putin to join the United Russia Party, and ever since then has been a strong supporter of Vladimir Putin and is currently under sanction for his connection to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I kind of treated these as two separate ways in which athletes entered into the world of broader society, criminality, and politics, but let's be real here, they're the same thing, especially in Russia. And really, the United Russia Party has had a strong history of inviting these athletes, including Vladimir Putin himself, but I'm going to save that for the judo section. So Russia continues to be very successful in sport. It's a national priority. It's tied into politics. It's tied into economics. The major companies in Russia see sport as an important thing to keep up. So Gazprom, the about half state-owned Russian gas company, is a huge investor in sporting, partially because of the importance in Russian society and the way that it is key to advertising in Russia. But in some ways, it's also a way to show deference to the state, to show support for Russia, the country. And that's one thing that Russian companies are somewhat required to do. You are allowed to have your business, but when the time comes, you have to use that business in support of the state. And really, if you follow any international sport, Russia continues to be a power player in many of them. And so now, just as the 1980 Olympics were a critical moment for sport in the Soviet Union, here comes the Sochi Olympics. And the Sochi Olympics of 2014 were a very important moment for demonstrating the entrenchment of the Putin regime. 2014, you of course have the Euromaidan happening at the same time as them, and eventually the invasion of Crimea. But you have the Maidan Revolution happening, and though that wasn't fully planned, of course, to happen during the Olympics, it did. But more importantly, it came after the Bolotnaya protests. It came out of a lot of civil unpopularity of Putin. Was kind of at a low point for his approval in Russia, partially out of his coming back to power. It was presumed that when he stepped aside to Dmitry Medvedev to follow the constitutional rules for presidential terms, it wasn't 100% that Putin would be back. It was understood that Putin was still in charge, and Medvedev was a puppet, yeah. But it was supposed to be a step down of power in 2012. There's lots of talk of succession, of who would fill in for this very powerful presidency. And when he didn't allow power to change hands, that wasn't completely popular. The Bolotnaya protests in Moscow were a response to that, were showing their unhappiness, and Putin had to reconfigure his political standing. Before that, he was treated as someone who could work more with the West. He was treated as someone who had various influences, including from these kind of liberal, Western-oriented technocrats. And early stage Putin did come down to a lot of support from the urban middle classes that were now protesting against him in Bolotnaya. and he was shifting to a broader kind of generic right-wing populism. Not that these elements were missing before. He was always a nationalist. He had always was, invading people. Chechnya happened. I'm not trying to portray him as a cuddly guy, but in 2014, he was into this transition period of what we think of him more of today as the much more authoritarian, much more based on this primordial feeling of Russian pride and just getting the empire back together. And there was political instability because of this. 2014 was a show of force. He rebuilt Sochi for it. Sochi was a not terribly impressive city on the Black Sea, which, by the way, was built on the former home of the Circassian people who were genocided by Russia, and the rebuilding of Sochi in this Russian nationalist image for the Olympics has a bit of a grave dancing element to it as well. Winter Olympics, mind you. These were the Winter Olympics in Sochi, which, by the way, the warmest part of Russia is where they held the Winter Olympics at, along with many other problems. It was not a super built up city at the time and not capable of handling the kind of traffic that would come into it. There was so much corruption that went into the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. A lot of this money went to the Rotenberg brothers. We can talk about them in the judo segment, who are Putin's closest confidants and who went on to build the Crimea Bridge. They made loads of money off of graft from building the Sochi Olympics. It was a set piece event to showcase the position of Russia in the world and the position of Putin in Russia. Going back to our through line here, super political. And as everyone's eyes were trained on the Olympics, in the last days of the Sochi 2014 Olympics, Russia invades Crimea. The planning for the Crimean invasion occurred while Putin was overseeing the Olympics. And this was not the first time he did this. At the 2008 Beijing Olympics, Putin was planning the invasion of Georgia, which occurred at the end of those Olympics. Russia really likes to time up its invasions with Olympic Games. And of course, after the invasion in 2014, Russia was the host of the Soccer Football World Cup of 2018. In the World Cup of 2018, its political purpose, though planned ahead of time, of course, its political use, I should say, was to demonstrate that Russia was still a completely normal part of world culture, even after the invasion of Ukraine. But that high point of the success of Sochi 2014 was not to last. Then came the doping scandal. Doping, performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, that good old vitamin S was of course always a part of Soviet sport. As I said, very scientific. That science included the good supplements. Drifting into another aside here, I have mixed feelings on the idea of doping in sport. I'm not fully against it per se, so long as it's regulated and out in the open. We are in a world right now where, every guy over the age of 40, and in many cases younger than that, is on testosterone supplements that would be illegal if they were an athlete. And there's some part of me that just wants to scratch that itch of seeing how much of freaks we can get together to kind of smash against each other. What can we get a person to do? Though that is then canceled out by the fact that it can be quite harmful to the body, and I don't believe that we should be doing that to a person. But again, the counter to that is that if you're an adult, you can make that decision to ruin yourself in order to jump abnormally high, run abnormally fast. There's a part of me in my, civil libertarian brain that says I'm not allowed to tell them no. So it's not exactly something I especially moralize about. There's certain specific examples, such as Lance Armstrong, the American bicycle racer, who was busted for doping and lost his career because of that. I'm not scandalized by the fact that he did doping. I'm scandalized by the fact that before he got caught, he was real arrogant of, I'm clean, but the sport is dirty, and here are these other guys who are doping. That's what I saw as more of the problem. So I don't know. If you're an adult and you can make this decision with your full consenting thinking brain, it's tough. I don't think that trying to ban absolutely everything is necessarily even possible. And as I described this doping scandal, keep it in mind that just because somebody tests clean
doesn't mean they are clean. There is an ever developing arms race between the people who develop various ways of doping, and this covers a lot of things. With Lance Armstrong, for example, it involved basically pumping extra oxygenated blood into your system. And so the various ways to do this, to enhance the human body in one way or another, there's always a new way to do it, and the ways to test for it always fall behind. And if you're in a place like Russia, the United States, China, that is more developed in the sports sciences, that means you are more easily put ahead. And also, it is kind of strange to me that there is the conundrum that when you get to the highest levels of sport, there will be more thorough levels of testing. So these super high level athletes, when they compete against each other, there's more stringent testing, more scientists trying to outcompete each other on either side of that competition. Whereas if you get to the low level, your regional Brazilian Jiu Jitsu competition, you'll see a guy who is obviously roided out of his mind, and there's really no way to tell him no because there's no testing. And really, when people try to moralize about putting an asterisk next to Barry Bonds' name to say that he cheated by taking steroids, all your favorite athletes from, before the 1980s, before other forms of performance enhancing drugs were in place, they were all on meth. Every old timey baseball player was a meth head. There's no way to really avoid it. Baseball is a tough schedule. You're getting through that somehow. And that somehow, through most of the sport's history, was methamphetamine. So it's something that has always been with us. But okay, Russian doping scandal. In 2014, there was a German documentary from the television channel ARD about Russian abuse of performance-enhancing drugs at the Sochi Olympics. This documentary spurred on an investigation that went back to the 2012 London Olympics and Russian practices of doping then. And the difference here between what Russia was doing and what most other sporting programs doing, which again, PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs, are very common in many of these places. The difference was that it was the Russian state that was doing it. The Russian government was even compelling athletes to take part in doping, taking performance-enhancing drugs and in other methods. And when WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, was kind of kicked in the side by this documentary, they do their own massive investigation. WADA, and the World Anti-Doping Agency, is the centralized agency that covers everything, which then has national level associates in testing labs that it works with. In Russia's case, this is RUSADA, the Russian Anti-Doping Agency. And so WADA was doing this investigation into Russia. They sent people to the RUSADA testing stations, and they come out with this massive report. That was, as I said, Russia was doing state-sponsored doping program. And beyond that, which to me is the part that gets into the really dark territory, is that the FSB, the Russian security services, were interfering in the investigation, and they went to these labs in Russia that were responsible for the testing and intimidated the employees at these labs to not cooperate with WADA. And as with everything, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Had there just been doping, to some level they could have gotten off lighter. But because the Russian state was intimidating witnesses, was intimidating investigators, this became a much bigger deal. You're using the violent arm of the state to prevent this investigation. And so in the end, as a result of these investigations, the Moscow Anti-Doping Center is decertified, as is RUSADA. RUSADA is dropped from WADA. Their results from RUSADA are no longer acceptable. And from then on, the International Olympic Committee and other sporting organizations began to ban Russian organizations. Now, this did not mean that they were banning Russian athletes per se. If an individual Russian athlete was not caught doping, then they're still allowed to compete. But it had to be done under an international banner as opposed to the Russian flag. This was seen most in the Olympics, but was seen in other international competitions as well, of having a fairly large Olympic team. And everyone understands that the Olympic team is being made up of Russian athletes. Everyone knows it. Russians know it. When an Olympic team athlete wins a medal, Russia celebrates it as a Russian win, but Russia could not take part. Russians could take part, but not Russia. These bans were renewed, and They were set to expire in 2022, but as we all know, in 2022, there were other problems with Russia, and the bans that would have been in place for this doping scandal became somewhat irrelevant because now there were bans put in place for the invasion. Really, the thing that got them the most for these bans was that Russia was stealing, co-opting the sporting infrastructure of Ukraine in the territories that it took over. That was considered a violation as well. Now, it was also a violation in 2014. They didn't really get in trouble for that so much, but according to the rule book, that was you're not going to ban countries from the Olympics because of in just having a war. The America is obviously still in the Olympics, and this discussion goes very deep as to, oh, if you ban Russia from these things, why don't you ban America? Why don't you ban Israel? Why don't you ban this or that country? And really, a lot of it came down to this: is that Russia stole Ukrainian sporting infrastructure, and that's super against the rules. But this ban, being a bit more serious because of the war, also kind of made it just easier to circumvent, to the point where now there are a lot of discussions about allowing Russia back into sport, as was the case with the Paralympics, as was the case with many sporting organizations, are at least discussing allowing Russia to compete again under its own flag. And some have done it, some just have discussions, because now they have moved it into the realm of politics. Here's that word again. This ban on Russia because of the invasion was a political ban. It was a political act that they did. And a political act is more neutral. It's more forgivable. This ban with doping was procedural. They broke the rules. You break the rules, you can't compete. But if it's just about how Russia acts on the world stage, well, isn't sport supposed to be outside of politics? Isn't sports supposed to be about bringing the world together? Isn't sport about ignoring the conflicts that divide us? And if that's the case, why not allow Russia back in? It's easier to get around. It's not as offensive. It's more viable and it's more convenient. The absence of Russia from a lot of these sporting events has been a financial hit to these organizations. Russia, as we'll discuss more in the next section, it's a lot of money into sport. There's a lot of money in appealing to Russian audiences. Russia's a big country. It's a big country with a large sporting tradition. Without them, there's less money in the system. And so banning Russia from competition because of the doping scandal was something they had to do, but banning Russia because of the war situation is something they are more subjective about. And when subjective, why not change your mind? Allow them back in. Get that money back. Get those athletes back, even though the athletes were never gone. Just never mind that. But of course, raises the question, are those original bans regarding doping, should they still be in place regardless of the war? And obviously, yes. Russia never made the changes that they were supposed to. Russia still did the violations that they did. There was no justice for it. There was no recompense. There's no correction. Following the rules, minus the war, Russia should still be banned, but they could ignore that. It feels kind of gross that the war is the less serious violation, that by shifting to the war ban, it's easier to cancel it. But that's the case. They no longer have to concern themselves with the original performance-enhancing drug-based ban. They're just ignoring that now. There's no review of that when Russia's invited back. Because as with sports, as is the case with a lot of the European economy regarding the import of oil and gas, a lot of sectors would very much prefer if they could just ignore that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is happening and can just go back to normal with what Russia, so they can get the money from Russia that they were used to. But let's look at some specific sports and the ways that Russia has dug its grubby little fingers in. And there are two ends of the pole of how they have done this. The first is, of course, money. Russia has deeply involved itself in many sports organizations, in large part because Russians are the ones who are most interested in investing in them. This is unfortunately the explanation for a lot of things in the world. The attention goes to who's paying for it. There is, of course, a ton of money to be made in sports like soccer, football, basketball, hockey. They're very profitable. Very, very profitable sports, and therefore invested in by all kinds of people because people will buy a sports team and expect to make a profit off of it. But when we get into the smaller sports that really only headline at the Olympics, if you are a fan of any particular sport, you know that there will be, take judo, for example, there's the worlds. And in a sport like judo, where one country, Japan, is so prominent in it, the national competition in Japan is practically of international quality on its own. But the normies aren't really watching all these competitions. If you like figure skating, you're watching it once every 4 years. If you like gymnastics, you're watching it once every 4 years. Unless you are really super into it, then you'll be more involved in the sport. But for most of us, that's not the case. And therefore, these sports are not hyper profitable. And when things are not hyper profitable, there's more influence from individual donors. Well, in steps Gazprom, the Russian state gas company, and natural gas company, I should say. And they have devoted a lot of money into sport. A lot of oligarchs of various stripes have devoted a lot of money into sport for the reasons I described before. Prestige, getting in good with Putin. And when you go into a system that has less money in it and you start throwing around more money, that's politics. Once you get one oligarch who is able to invest themselves heavily into a particular sports league, they then get their little minions in, the lower level people that are harder to replace. And then the other pole of it, the kind of blunt force of just buying stuff, is that the Russians have been involved in these sports for a very long time. They have been quite successful in a lot of these sports for a very long time. And so if you are a fan of these sports, you have your list of your favorites, and sometimes those favorites will be Russian. This is what soft power is made out of. It's made out of positive associations between a country and a thing that you like. And through sport, Russia has a tremendous amount of soft power. Boxing, wrestling, hockey, all these things have famous Russians in them. They draw Russian fans to the sport, and they draw fans of the sport to Russia. And a good way to start with this is hockey, because what I'm about to describe kind of began with going against the state before eventually looping back into it. I'm from the Detroit area. I'm a millennial from the Detroit area, which means that in the 1990s, the late 1990s, everything was about the Detroit Red Wings. This was their high point. And they accomplished a lot of that with what's called the Russian Five. Sergei Fedorov. I'm going to read these now with the American way of reading them. I'm forcing off my Russian way of reading them. Sergei Fedorov, Vladimir Konstantinov, Slava Kozlov, Slava Fetisov, and Igor Larionov. It was a great team. They brought a style of very aggressive hockey to the ice that was very domineering and got good results. And it actually began with the defection of Sergei Fedorov and Vladimir Konstantinov. They left the Soviet Union. Well, they probably shouldn't have. And it was a bit of a kind of an espionage story to get them over. They defected to become Americans, which kind of leads to their later careers being more questionable. They're both very successful players in the Soviet Union, and Detroit made a decision to try to poach Russian athletes, which in the late Soviet period still meant defection. It wasn't just, handing someone a bunch of money and they got onto a plane and came over. So if you're a millennial, if you were a 90s kid from Detroit, these people were heroes. In fact, the last time that I went to America, there's the Henry Ford Museum. If you're ever in Detroit, go to the Henry Ford Museum. Basically, Henry Ford was super rich and had a bunch of very famous friends. So he brought Thomas Edison's workshop, kind of removed it from New Jersey, brought it to Detroit area, to Dearborn. It's a museum of innovation and all the smart people. And when I went, the temporary exhibition at the Henry Ford Museum was about 1990s Detroit Red Wings. No one there took that as a political statement whatsoever. Like I said, they're heroes at the time. Everyone loved these guys. But what was Sergei Fedorov's later career? Sergei Fedorov went on to become the coach of CSKA Moscow and split his time between the United States and Russia. I did look into the career of Vladimir Konstantinov. He does not seem to have followed the same path, but Sergei Fedorov became a Russian propagandist. I'll read this from Detroit Hockey Now, a Detroit hockey website, obviously, from April of 2022, titled Red Wings Daily, Is Fedorov Pro-Putin? Monday was a tough day for former Detroit Red Wings star Sergei Fedorov. For the first time in the KHL playoffs, CSKA Moscow, the team Fedorov coaches, was tasting defeat. They lost 4-0 to SKA St. Petersburg, leading their third-round series deadlocked at 1-1. Prior to that setback, CSKA Moscow were rolling along on a 9-game winning streak since the postseason got underway. But in the long run, Monday's loss might be the last of Fedorov's worries. Photographed behind the CSKA bench during his recent game, Fedorov was standing in front of a giant banner that reads, "Putin is my president." Is Fedorov a supporter of Russian President Vladimir Putin? Hard to say for sure. He's never been one to discuss politics, although he did defect from the former Soviet Union in 1990 to play for the Red Wings. Then again, former Red Wings defenseman Slava Fedosov fought the Soviet system to gain freedom for Russian players to play in the NHL. Yet, as a member of the Russian Duma, another one of these athlete politicians, he's under USA sanctions for his support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Whether Fedorov thinks about Putin and his ongoing war, a picture is worth 1,000 words. There's been a push for him to be under consideration as the next coach of the Red Wings. That won't be happening if there's even an inkling that he's backing Putin. So yeah, has he directly supported Vladimir Putin? Not outwardly, because so much of his career is reliant on the United States. But hasn't said anything against it. Thinking about a more recent dominant player, Alexander Ovechkin, the Washington Capitals. When in America, he stridently avoids the topic of the war, of Putin, of all that, because he's not in politics. Goes to Russia, however, he is a key part of the Team Putin system, a bunch of athletes who got together to support the president. Generally, hockey fandom as a whole is extremely obnoxious when it comes to Russian players, saying that, oh, this Russian player, if he says anything against the war, Putin will act against his family, when in reality, they're wearing St. George's ribbon or something like that. And next sport, to keep it on the ice, figure skating. And I'll attach it into gymnastics, the aesthetic sports, because they're similar in that way. This is an area where Russia has been quite dominant, but the secret to this dominance is child abuse. Russia is famed for its very brutal training methods, and it's again one of those things that find its way into fiction. And for this, we can pick a particular villain to embody all the problems here. Eteri Tutberidze, a Russian Georgian, and in fact, though she was barred from coaching the Olympics due to the general Russian bans, her daughter was on the Georgian team, so she was there anyway. And her methods of training make me feel ill. Essentially, the idea is that within figure skating and gymnastics as well, being extremely light is an advantage to get in those really big jumps and where you can spin around a bunch of times and you're not hindered as much by gravity. And they accomplish this eating disorders, and they accomplish a lot of the big jumps by doing techniques that are extremely damaging to the body, to the point where Eteri's trainees end up physically broken by the time they hit their mid-20s, early 20s in some cases. And in fact, the Russians being banned, some of the Russians not being able to compete, has meant that the careers of them have been extended because they were not undergoing this training. And when their bans expire soon, they'll be able to compete older than they would have otherwise. And the big vibe shift of this Olympics was with the gold medalist for women's ice skating, Alyssa Liu. Her story was essentially that she went through the starvation and all that when she was young, but quit because she hated it. But she came back saying she'll do it because she loves it and isn't going to starve herself and is going to be healthy. And she won gold, a very charismatic person. She's a celebrity now. But the response from the Russian fandom has been essentially, her saying she's not going to starve herself is an insult to the sport because you have to have an eating disorder or you're not a figure skater. I'm like, oh my God, what? You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to kind of wink at it, maybe. You're supposed to talk about the hard work, but no, it is the eating disorder, according to them. And if you do not have an eating disorder, then your win is illegitimate. And that's gross, but that's Russia. Moving on to some combat sports, because that's where Russia is very involved. Judo. Judo was my sport. Hope to get back into it, but unfortunately, I have sciatica, and I need to take care of that soon. As I was training up in judo, Russians have played a considerable role. One of my first coaches, the Moscow regional champion, that he himself was actually Dagestani. Caucasians play a big role in grappling in general, and the Soviets really prioritized judo. And for Putin specifically, judo is Putin's sport. He himself, his moment that he describes as a thing that turned him into, a disciplined man who could take on the world, was joining judo. And the key with Putin, you have to understand, is that he himself is not a particularly impressive or interesting person, but what has gotten him everywhere has been he's always had kind of a father figure or a patron who is willing to raise him up to the next level. And one of the first people who did that for Putin was his judo coach, who was a fatherly figure to him. And his judo training partners at the time were the Rotenberg brothers, who are some of the most important oligarchs in all of Russia. They're the ones who built up Sochi, who built up the Crimean Bridge. That's them. There's loyalists, are his judo training partners from when he was a kid. And what makes judo unique as a sport in a way is how equitable it is. Many sports are either dominated by the big sporting countries, United States, Russia, China, because those are the countries that can put all the resources into supporting their athletes, or are regional favorites. Finland creates a lot of biathletes. Water polo is big in Hungary. But judo is a sport that's popular all over the world, is very accessible, and there's a lot of countries where judo and other martial arts are really the only sports that they gain success in. Not to denigrate their other sporting programs, but it's just a very accessible sport. Central Asia, the Caucasus, there's a lot of taekwondo coming out of Africa, for example. But because of this equal playing field, because of how broad it is also a sport that has often run into the most political controversies. So Israel, for example, often runs into boycotts in sport. But one of the sports that they will most often face other people in is judo. So when there is one of these controversies, it's because in Iranian judoka, Iran, by the way, country with a very strong wrestling pedigree, so they show up in grappling a lot as well. When they have faced off against Israelis, they would refuse to shake hands, that kind of thing, at which point there's a brief controversy where how dare they not shake hands and respect the sport of judo and respect, how dare they bring politics into this. And the International Judo Federation has begun very adept at moving past these controversies very quickly. They have not shut people out, but have scolded for not taking part in it. But unfortunately, what that has also come down to is that judo has been a sport that has been one of the earliest in allowing the Russians to come back in under their own flags as Russia, not just neutral athletes. So last year, the International Judo Federation made the decision, Russia's back in, saying, quote, historically, Russia has been a leading nation in world judo, and their full return is expected to enrich competition at all up levels while upholding the IGF's principles of fairness, inclusivity, respect, but with all the criticisms of that I've already made. Boxing. Boxing was more controlled by Russia than probably anything else in the world. The former International Boxing Regulatory Organization was the International Boxing Association. International Boxing Association was so corrupt that it was disaffiliated from the International Olympic Committee. The International Olympic Committee is horrendously corrupt. The selection of any city to be the host of the Olympics is a corrupt bidding process. There's so much graft in everything involving the Olympics and really international sport, and yet the International Boxing Association stood out as being so corrupt, of being so out of bounds, of being so ludicrous that it can no longer be a part of the IOC. A truly impressive feat of criminality. So what did they do? Umar Kremlev was the head of the International Boxing Association, and he essentially just relocated it from Switzerland to Russia, made all the staff Russian, made it so the only funder for the IBA was Gazprom. And after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what he did was try to ban Ukraine from competing in boxing because the Ukrainian boxing organization tried to replace its pro-Russian, very pro-Russian leadership with a pro-Ukrainian one, again in the middle of an invasion by Russia. And so Umar Kremlev made the decision that this new leadership of Ukrainian boxing was illegitimate, and therefore I'm not going to let you box anymore, which no longer became relevant in 2023 when the whole organization was removed from the world of international boxing and replaced with world boxing, a thing which should happen more often. World boxing, still probably corrupt, still probably criminal, still making decisions I don't like, but within the bounds of normal criminal, as opposed to extraordinary criminal. These have all been mostly amateur sport, Olympic sport, but I do want to kind of touch into the world of professional sport as well. So looking at soccer, football, this is a sport that makes so much money, is involved in so many places. It can't be bought out like boxing can. Like, it's profitable. Amateur boxing is not so profitable. Professional boxing, yes. Amateur boxing, not so much. So it's easy for an oligarch to buy it. Football is more decentralized. But one owner of a football club was Roman Abramovich, one of the most important members of the Putin court. He was apparently the person who put forward Putin's name to become president way back in the 90s, and they're trying to decide who would replace Yeltsin. He's part of the family, though he has not been as close to decision making in recent years. He was the owner of Chelsea Football Club, and when he saw the sanctions coming, he tried to sell while he still could make money. He did not sell Chelsea fast enough, and therefore the money from that sale is currently arrested. It's not accessible, but it is not seized. Should be though, along with everything else Russian in Europe. Going on to mixed martial arts, and if you are a mixed martial arts nerd, you will know the name Oleg Taktarov. He was an important early figure in the development of the UFC and mixed martial arts in general, because I think that's very important because he brought Sambo to mixed martial arts. And Sambo was mixed martial arts before there was mixed martial arts. I kind of want to do an episode about Sambo now. I don't know. But yeah, so Sambo is a combination of both grappling and striking. It's not exactly mixed martial arts, but in Ukraine, a lot of the mixed martial arts gyms grew out of Sambo. A self-defense without weapons is what it stands for, not the racial slur that is in the United Kingdom. So he comes over with a skill set that is familiar to what you would recognize now as mixed martial arts, when the early Ultimate Fighting Championships were between practitioners of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, mainly, that was put on as a display case for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, boxing, kickboxing, more one-dimensional fighters. He came in more rounded out than most and created this very early connection between the world of mixed martial arts and Russia. Though he was an actor, he came to the United States to pursue acting, is what happened. But in addition to being a historical figure within the world of the UFC and MMA, he's also a hardcore pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian bigot. Whenever a Ukrainian or Georgian or someone else in the world of mixed martial arts says something against Russia, such as Roman Dolidze, the current middleweight champion, he gets real indignant. How dare these sportsmen step outside their role and comment on politics? It's not the role of sports to interfere with politics. This refrain that we hear over and over again, combined with, of course, the fact that he does not stay out of politics himself. Responding to the 2022 invasion, he said, quote, "I have some information that rapists and perverts from all over the world are actually fighting in Ukraine now, as they always have. The security services are constantly finding evidence of not just torture or murder, but perversion. In Ukraine, the most aggressive 1 or 2% have imposed on everyone else everything that's been happening for the last 8 years. These Westerners have put down roots. I went to Kyiv 3 or 4 months before February 24th. Ukrainian was no longer spoken at the borders. Some spoke English. I don't know the other languages." Like, hardcore. This guy is deep in, and he's the one saying that athletes don't comment on politics while going full on, like, Zed Patriot, like, psychopath. That's always how it works, isn't it? When you comment on politics, when you say something about the world, when you commemorate your dead colleagues, that's political. That's not something an athlete, a sportsman should do. But when I comment on something in the world, that's just sharing information. That's just talking like it is, right? Another big Russian name in the world of mixed martial arts that is probably more famous, Fyodor Emelianenko. As you can tell from that Enko, he is of Ukrainian heritage. He's originally from Luhansk before moving to Sardaskol in the Belgorod region. In the era of Pride Fighting Championships, he was a champion and a very famous one. There was always the question of, is this UFC fighter going to fight Fyodor? Is this American fighter, is this UFC fighter going to go over and face Fyodor? Because he's the real champion. You're not the champion until you beat him. Until Pride FC went bankrupt because it was owned by the Yakuza, bought out by the UFC. Man, early mixed martial arts was just so much more weird than it is now. Bring back the Yakuza. The Yakuza ran a less problematic organization, but very famous guy. He was very famous for his very taciturn nature, of the stereotypical, I don't show emotion, I am Russian strong, and a Sambo guy. Like, so after his sports career, say it with me now, becomes a member of the United Russia Party and a supporter of Vladimir Putin. He did propaganda while he back in 2014. and criticized Russians for avoiding military service. His younger brother Ivan is in the army and said that he would also join the invasion of Ukraine if called upon, though he is ineligible for military service at the moment. But the current UFC, it has had a lot of Russian fighters, though I hesitate to say Russian. Most of them are Dagestani specifically, not ethnic Russians as much, and also many of them have not identified with the label of Russian. However, many of these fighters have still been attached to Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov. Kadyrov has invested heavily in combat sports, wrestling, and MMA mostly. If you look all the way back to 2018 is one of the early ones that I could see of The Guardian commenting on this attachment between the UFC and Kadyrov from this article from The Guardian from 2018. Why the UFC's sports washing of Chechen's dictator is a problem. The presence of Ramzan Kadyrov in the front row of the UFC's first show in Moscow highlights a troubling link between the Chechen strongman and the world's largest MMA promotion. Fast forward to 2023, a CNN article. UFC maintains links with Russian fighters and others' connection to sanctioned Chechen warlord despite Ukraine invasion. Quote, the video looks like a gun advertisement on steroids, shot in the style of a music video with quick edits and a pulsating beat. Three athletic-looking men test fire a variety of machine guns, rocket launchers, assault rifles, and handguns. Surrounded by bearded soldiers in military gear, the three men are shown smiling and laughing, seemingly having a good time. Except this is not your run-of-the-mill gun range outing. Ultimate Fighting Championship fighters Kamaru Usman, Justin Gaethje are the trio in the video posting online about the notorious Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov in November last year, after the invasion, 2022, celebrating their visit to his compound in Russia to see, quote, how real men and defenders of the fatherland learn to fight. And UFC fighters have been in and out of Chechnya. Ramzan has really been investing in MMA in the area and has bringing in fighters to promote it. And as recently as last year, November of last year, former champion John Jones, a controversial, so to say, not a great dude, but very dominant champion at one point, went to celebrate the birthday of Ramzan Kadyrov's son, Adam Kadyrov. Now, the UFC itself does not maintain relations with sanctioned individuals, as they say, but the culture of it runs deep. And the last thing to talk about that's not really a sport, but because it bothers me, the kind of stereotypes it invokes, chess. Chess was very big in the Soviet Union. If you've seen Queen's Gambit, Anya Taylor-Joy's character, who plays a very poor person from Kentucky, but is very good at chess, she ends up going to the Soviet Union and is basically paradise for her because everyone in the Soviet Union plays chess and she's happy. Chess has been very bought into the idea of Russia. Whenever there's a lazy writer, they'll say that, oh, Putin plays chess while America plays checkers. And I'm not going to say that America is particularly adept at gaming, but there's this addiction to the chess metaphor when no, Russia's not being that clever. They're not the grand strategists. They're not the people looking over all to surveil. They've really been just as disorganized as anyone. The problem is that so has America and so has Europe. Putin is not the chess grandmaster. Stop, just stop it. It's annoying. Stop it. But the head of the International Chess Federation, FIDE, is a Russian, Arkady Dvorkovich. When the war first started in 2022, he gave a generic war is bad statement, but was rebuked by his Russian colleagues before saying that he supports the Russian army. Now, he's definitely run the organization in a pro-Russian fashion, despite still doing sanction when they have no other choice. But then you have characters such as Sergei Karyakin, a chess champion, who's just a full-on ultra-nationalist, Z-patriot, war propagandist, whole deal, deep in, actively in support of the Russian army, actively in support of the genocide of Ukraine. Just an absolute psychopath. And to bring this into chess, a lot of famous chess people have been not good people. It is a game that, because it has the association with genius, people think, oh, this person is a chess genius, therefore they're going to be a little bit wacky, and I have to just allow that because, you know, the eccentric geniuses of chess are allowed to. And no, Bobby Fischer was a Nazi. But anyway, no need to dwell on my biases against chess champions. We can run next to our conclusions. In summation, 1. Russia continues the Soviet legacy of the heavy focus on sport, which includes a significant amount of financial support for both domestic and international sport. 2. Athletes are an important part of Russian society. Athletes are used as a tool for legitimacy attachment to famous athletes is seen as a important political asset to have in the minds of the people, while at the same time, in direct contradiction to this, they will claim that sportsmen are outside of politics and therefore do not face sanction because of politics. They are both political and apolitical at the same time. As a part of this legitimacy, they are often used outwardly for political propaganda, but will play a game where they are more free to do this propaganda in Russia, in the Russian language, but in America will play it safe and avoid the consequences for their actions. 4. People grow up watching Russian athletes, which creates positive associations with Russia. These positive associations with Russia can then be used as soft power politics to convince the citizens of other countries that there should not be things such as sanctions, which can affect the whole of the country. Someone who is a huge fan of 1990s Detroit hockey may have more positive feelings towards Russia, and as a result, less likely to take a resistant stance against them. And lastly, that Russian oligarchs simply care more about purchasing soft power than in other countries. And because of that, they're able to take over sporting organizations. If you are the only one showing up with a bunch of cash, you can take over. We've seen it so many places. But ultimately, to finish things off, I'll say that this is not just about sport. We can have this same discussion about Eurovision, fandom of different fandoms, gaming, the arts world, including opera and ballet, because you can't have ballet without the Bolshoi. And it leads to a bunch of people who are hyper focused on their hobby and what they watch on television. And the real world intrudes on the fantasy world that they watch on their screen. It leads to sometimes vindictive results. Ukraine is ruining your fun. Ukraine is crashing in on your escapism. And to many people, that's the worst sin you can commit. And as a result of Russia's heavy investment in a lot of these areas and Ukraine's comparative absence, some, yes, boxing, for example, but because Ukrainian culture, sport as a part of culture, is not as visible in the rest of the world, that means Ukraine has had substantially less soft power. And even among people who may express sympathies for Ukraine, there is a simple fact that many of them are more used to Russia. They're more used to seeing Russian representation. They're more used to interacting with Russian products, Russian literature, Russian sport, and therefore, on many levels, relate more to Russians than they do Ukrainians. And that has been a serious hurdle to try to jump over, and one that needs to be actively counteracted. So that will conclude our episode. Thank you very much for listening. I wanted to go for breadth. The initial version of this episode was really only about the sporting organizations and the various ways that Russians have wormed their way into it. But as I was developing it over the course of weeks, so many other things kind of wormed into my brain that I had to say that it expanded more and more into a stretched out overview of everything, which involves sacrificing some depth for breadth, of course. But thank you very much for listening. If you would like to get other resources about Ukraine or other places to donate, you can go to our link tree in our description. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. And normally I do not like to tell you how you're supposed to give me money, just say that it exists. And if you want to give me money, the option's there. But in this case, I do want to give a detail that it is much better to join Patreon via the website, so patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype, as opposed to going through your phone. Purchases made through your app store have additional fees attached to it that get caught up and go to Apple as opposed to me. And also it puts a delay on when the money can go, I believe 75 days, which can be annoying. So the going through the Apple store is very suboptimal. If you have the choice, go to the website instead. Feels weird to tell you what to do on that, but fees are bad. So yes, if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters and get onto our Discord where you can ask us questions and contribute to what topics do you want to be covered. So thank you very much to our supporters. Thank you to Randy McNerland, Voices in My Header from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Damascus Medusa, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivana Kukratskaya, Mike, Kevin Upperton, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, T. Bart, Barbara Stration, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Danny Louise, Marguerite, Dimitri Litvin, Dennis Natebaum, Vivek, James Burke, Allison Chainsaw, Big Meg, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazan, Andy S., John Gates, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, Chris Bennington, Levy Grove, James Wise, Alex Strochnell, Anne McDonald, Jerd, Victor Matei, Scott Torkiuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Thedkel, Evelyn, Veronica Aim, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Marianne, RDK, Laurie Halila, Christopher Yee, Lemonikin, Demetrio Munoz, Ursula Zolonkov, Noah Brown, Glowing Wind, Dystopian Fiction, Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Schnashkis, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Denna Jones, Joseph Verlone, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, Bucktron 2021, Florian Kukul, Matthew Rowe, Bill, and Tristan Brody. Thank you all very much for your support. You make this all possible. So until next time, have a happy Easter, have a happy Passover, and Slava Ukraini.